You go to the right wing, it's much harsher. If you haven't done it, I'd urge you to take a look on the internet at a very significant memorandum by Lewis Powell. Powell was a corporate lobbyist, later appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, and he wrote a very important memorandum, very influential memorandum, I think 1971, which he wrote actually to the Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby. And what he told the Chamber of Commerce is, he said, the entire free enterprise system, the basis of our liberty, is under attack. The universities, the media, the government have all been taken over, literally. It's very paranoid, but it reflects the attitudes. They've been taken over by left-wing extremists who are going to destroy our freedoms. It's a little bit like listening to Mitt Romney and the rest of them today. The only choices, he said, are between freedom, free enterprise, or bureaucratic regulation of our lives by the state. And they're winning. They've taken over everything. They're destroying free enterprise. He said the businessmen, he said, are the group that have the least influence in the country on government, on the economy, and everything else. And he said we've got to do something to mobilize. And the core part was the universities, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. He said, after all, we, the business world, have the resources. We have the money. You know, we fund them. We pay them. We're what's now called job creators, you know what I mean, profit creators. And so we have the money. So we've got to mobilize and organize and do something about it. And right at that point, this kind of common conception across the spectrum did lead to many significant changes, which you're living in right now. So take, say, student debt. Debt is now, as you probably know, over $1 trillion. That's more than credit card debt. That's phenomenal. Well, that's a crucial way of dealing with the failure of the institutions responsible for indoctrination of the young. You come out of college with a heavy debt, you're trapped. That's the rest of your life. Maybe you wanted to be, say, a public interest lawyer when you went into Harvard, but come out with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. You're just going to have to go into a corporation to pay off your debt. You get trapped in the corporate culture. It's the end of that. And it generalizes, it's supposed to generalize across the society. That's the point at time, in fact, early 70s, when debt started to, when college tuition started to go through the roof. And by now it's outlandish. And it is incidentally not an economic necessity. That's very easy to see. So our own country, our own society in the 1950s, that's the period of the greatest growth, 50s and the 60s, greatest economic growth in history, very successful period. Education wasn't entirely free, but it was fairly free. So when I went to college in 1945, University of Pennsylvania, it was $100 a year, which was, you know, a lot of money for working students, which we were, but you could very easily get a scholarship to pay it and work on the side. You could make out, not like now. The GI Bill was passed, and that brought a huge number of students who would never have been able to get into college, enabled them to go to college free. And that was a major, big effect on their lives, of course, but also a major spur to the development of the society. It's part of the reason why the 50s and the 60s were such a successful growth period. Furthermore, if you look at other countries, you can see clearly that it's not an economic necessity. So go across the border to Mexico. That's a poor country. They have, it's not like us, richest country in the world. They have quite a respectable higher education system. Noam, University of, I lectured there a couple times. Very high standards, lively student body, rotten salaries, of course, but reasonable facilities, you know, not big sports stadiums and that kind of thing. But it's free. And there's a reason why it's free. About 10 years ago, the government tried to institute a small tuition. There was a national student strike across the country. It beat it back, still free. In fact, one of the main administration buildings on the Noam campus is still occupied. It's become a kind of an activist center on campus. This kind of thing, incidentally, is going on all over the continent now. In Chile, there have been major student strikes for almost a year now, which have become national strikes, which are aiming to undermine the system of the system of education that was imposed by the Pinochet dictatorship, which we installed back in 1973, which created basically a sharply two-tiered educational system, education for the rich, nothing, very little for anyone else. That's been very effective. It's spreading through the hemisphere, and in places like Mexico, it persists. In fact, it's more than that. Mexico had a left-wing mayor, Mexico City, a couple of years ago, and he established a university in the city, which is not only free, but is open admissions. So anybody can go. They have compensatory courses for people who have to have a little more background than they got out of school. And it's pretty good. I lectured there too, met students and teachers, fairly high standards. The point is, these are not economic issues. Same is true in rich countries, like Germany is a rich country. Education's free. And as I say, here it was not free, but very low paying, except for the gentleman's club back in not very long ago, 50s and 60s. Well, but these are effective techniques of indoctrination. You know it yourself, and there are other things like them. Sam mentioned the increasing corporatization of the universities, which is part of the more general growth and power of corporate institutions in the society altogether. Not that they weren't there before. They were the dominant force in the society for well over a century. But there's been a big change in the last 30 years. It's the change that's symbolized by the Occupy slogan, which is now taken over everywhere, 99%, 1%. The last 30 years, I won't go through the details because you know them, there's been virtual stagnation or decline for the majority of the population, plenty of wealth generated, but going into mostly a fraction of 1% of the population.